is something which most people are not really up to date with. And now what we're seeing is targeting weaknesses in the web, in applications, and open source code. And an example of that, we look on the right-hand side. Those are the number of vulnerabilities which have been reported on pretty common supplier systems, Cisco network devices, the Citrix, Palo Alto, and a big security vendor. You can't necessarily patch all of these all of the time in the right way. So you've actually got to look at how do you mitigate rather than necessarily relying 100% on patches. And just as a trending, what we're seeing is there's a lot more what they call families, which is criminal groups. In 2019, there was some 19 groups doing ransomware. Last year, 125. And one of them is now offering ransomware as a service. So you don't even have to create your own, you can rent it. Moving on, one of the key things we're seeing is that's enabling these attacks is the perimeter is gone. The idea of having, the network access control, your firewall, they're all very good. Unfortunately, they struggle when the workforce is remote, when you're engaging contractors or third parties, when people are using personal devices, when you've got IoT devices, and more importantly, when you're now accessing cloud and SaaS applications, which are not on your network. And so therefore presents what we call, the user as the new perimeter, which brings us to looking at how do you secure that? And there's a principle or an approach called Xero Trust, which is how do you continuously authenticate users? How do you make sure they've only got the right level of access that they should have? And how do you monitor this? So the idea is you trust nothing. You verify it all the time. So you verify the user, you validate the device. Is this device secure? Has it got the right patches on, etc.? Is it in the right location, the right time of day? And you limit what they can actually do. And we'll go through that. That's a sort of example. This is how we work, with everything facing the attackers, the VPNs, the NAC, the IPS, the firewalls. And whilst on the left-hand side, the guys using SaaS and bring your own device, etc., they're all parachuting in behind the wall. And that's effectively what has changed the thinking. An example of that is really what we're looking at here is once upon a time, all these users would be talking to the data center applications. Now they have a need to talk to e-commerce. They have a need to talk to Office 365 or Box or Salesforce. And a lot of their workloads are running in the public cloud. So that gives us a conundrum. What do we do? And the approach is we use all of these things, which is a bit of a nightmare. So we've got lots of acronyms, but how do we secure access? Well, to a degree, this is where we stand today. People working from home, for instance, are typically using VPNs to secure their access to the data center. What that means is once they're on the VPN, once they pass the VPN and been authenticated, basically, if their machine's been infected, then basically once they're in, that malicious actor can move throughout the organization because there's nothing that stops him. He's been authenticated. So what we're seeing is the rise of software which will allow us to segment a user to an application. So I'm a user and my job is to work on the loans application. Well, guess what? The loans application is the only thing I can access and the only thing I can see. So if my machine is infected, it cannot move from that application. So worst case is I've restricted the risk to a single application or a single server. Added to that, I can make it really more difficult. I can add multi-factor authentication for all applications. So now I can force it to be that this user needs to authenticate using a biometric, which makes it very, very difficult for an attacker to assume that user's personality. So now I am really securing a user down to an application and ensuring it is the user. And finally, for privileged users, I can actually create very specific virtual machines on their machine, which forces them into doing, it's the only thing that can be done on that machine. So I'm looking at how do I secure my environment when a lot of my users are, and this same approach can be used internally, but it's just become very, very important externally nowadays with work from home. Unfortunately, we've got a whole bunch of other services that we need to access. And so what we've been doing is having users come into the data center network and then out. So, what's called backhauling. Unfortunately, that's very cumbersome, time consuming, and doesn't necessarily bring the same level of security for your cloud environments with it. So it works for on-premise, but doesn't work that well for cloud. So we're seeing a move towards what's now called software access service edge, which is where the cloud is becoming, cloud services themselves are becoming the network authentication layer, the routing layer, the ability. So instead of going into the data center, I've still got some, a set of my workforce, which probably will, because that's all they do. But the rest are moving through the perimeters now managed from the cloud. Which makes it, I can apply web gateway techniques, so I can look for malicious traffic. I can apply access controls. I can look at data leakage, data theft from upload and download into cloud type applications or SaaS applications. So I'm starting to move my security for user access and to some degree of cloud data and cloud applications into the cloud, because that's probably the best place that it fits. Then we finally write that off is obviously with everybody working from home, we got this thing about safe as houses. Well, it's the least thing we are, because I might be working on my machine at home, but there might be 3 kids, 3 children, you doing other things on my network. One of their machines may be open, it could be attacked. I could be at the coffee shop, and therefore I'm on the free Wi-Fi, and easily spoofed from a man-in-the-middle attack where somebody's looking to track the traffic between my machine and the coffee shop's Wi-Fi. So it does bring a lot of security headaches with it. So rounding this off, we go, you got to look at particular tools. Here we're talking about EDR, the endpoint detection and response, to be able to secure attacks or traffic and attacks from Office 365 in the cloud, for instance, but also from malicious Wi-Fi access. So EDR comes in there. At the same time, we talked about add multi-factor authentication. You start to secure if credentials get stolen. The thief cannot use those because he doesn't have your other authentication requirements. And the trend now start to look at passwordless, removing passwords from the equation. Plus, at the same time, back to basics. You still got to consider antivirus, device control, encryption, etc. So really, it's 2 ends. One is my users accessing my applications. The other one is my users outside the office. How does somebody get into his machine via the back door, if you like? So that's really how we're seeing the user. And really, it's a complex process and needs lots of analysis. But what we're looking at doing is saying, where are all of the shall we say, the user points, the devices and the users, and what services and applications do they need to access? And actually, how do we design security that fits each one? That doesn't necessarily mean an individual security product. I'm really talking about how do you design the Zero Trust architecture, and then how do you overlay the software and services which actually enable that. We talked about the user, and I really thought we should mention her because she is pretty crucial in this. And really, it's how do you create cyber awareness? And really, you've got to look at adopting an awareness model. You've got to look at something which takes you through in a structured way and builds out the process inside the organization, addressing real issues, getting users to understand what phishing is and what ransomware is, understanding the detail of the risk of working from home, etc. And using things like gamification and e-learning to do this and reinforce it. And it becomes part of the business curriculum. So it really has to be, and whilst we not, we might say, well, actually, yeah, this will save us. The answer is that and by the way, a copy of these slides will be available, so I don't have to read this lot. It's still amazing that, the majority of people will still get it wrong, or sorry, close to half the people will still get it wrong. So it's not the single silver bullet. So we've talked about the perimeter. We looked at some of the weaknesses in access, and we've looked at the importance of the user. But that's just the start. The endpoint, the user device itself is just the landing zone today. It's where somebody wants to get into your house or into your applications in this case. Really what they're looking at is, how do I get to the crown jewels? How do I get to your data center, to your AWS environment, to your Salesforce environment? And because we've now got hybrid infrastructures, cloud and on-prem, it increases the risk because there's more attack vectors, there's more things you've got to look at to defend. Moving laterally, lovely name, moving laterally. Moving around inside your organization means they can find those assets that will bring your business down. And whilst we think of this in the US and big companies, in South Africa in the last, few months, last 6-9 months, we've had a very large private hospital group. We've had a telco, and we've had a large insurance organization. All had their business disrupted for several weeks by this type of attack, and particularly because traffic in the organization now is what they call east-west. So it's within the organization. It's moving between virtual machines or containers, and less so north-south out into the user network. So we've looked at this, and similarly, it's about Xero Trust. The old way was to look at using firewalls, physical firewalls, and more lately in cloud environments and virtual environments, virtual appliances, virtual firewalls. The new way is really to look at securing workloads rather than securing network ports and segmenting via the network. We're now segmenting via the workload itself. So the processor, the server, the application. And what that allows us to do is take a scenario like this, where you've got lots of things talking to each other, break that down into what makes up a service that you're delivering as an organization, and then take it one stage further to how am I able to actually secure a specific application within that overall service. And with that, I mean, we can see what's communicating. We can authorize those communications and only those communications. So that means you can create granular policies which will apply, which means that if the policy, if you are a user or if you're a machine that's been infected and you are now trying to get to this service, you will not be able to, because you are not defined in the policy. You will be actively blocked. Which gives us the ability really to secure things down to at a very low level. So we're blocking anything which is not explicitly allowed. And finally, well, not finally, but also within this, we can actually do it at a user level. So I can actually define this user can only access this process on this machine. And given that, it means he will never be able to do anything else. If his machine is taken over in any way, that attacker, if he did a port scan to look for IP addresses which he could target, he would see nothing, because that machine would not see anything. So we're starting to hide things away from the attacker using segmentation, or Xero Trust implemented in what we call micro-segmentation as the approach. And at the same time, we're able to ask questions during these processes. You know, I'm not going through these, but I can qualify, have machines got the right level of patching on before I actually let them access a server? Have they got the wrong type of software on? Have they got a remote access piece of code on there? So I can start to dictate and stop either malicious or ignorant systems talking to other systems because they're not authorized. So I can actually get from the endpoint to the workload and establish very, very tight controls, which you cannot do with network security devices or systems. And finally on that, once you got to the data, how do you protect your data? Well, unfortunately, look at your secure, your high profile databases. You've got to look at two things. Security, which is stopping all unauthorized people touching data, so touching customer information in the SQL database. And you've got to look at privacy, which is what should authorized and unauthorized users actually be able to see. So it ranges from putting in access monitoring through to firewalling, which is blocking certain fields in the database. And at the other end, in terms of static masking and dynamic masking. So when I present a user a set of return data, if it's PCI based, for instance, then I mask the credit card details. For these users, for another user, I may not. So the idea is you start to get down into looking at the workloads again at a lower level. So that's really the areas we see in terms of Xero Trust applied to users' access and to workloads in the cloud, on-premise. So where to next? Ronnie, are you available? This is, Ronnie is going to do a quick demo, but this is basically what we're doing is, how do you understand your security posture? If I ask you today, how secure are you? Where are your weaknesses? It's very difficult to determine that. We recently partnered with or last year we partnered with a company who does security score, which is cyber. Ronnie?
I'm here.
Can you take this over and do the demo?
Yeah, so can you just stop sharing and then I'll share?
Yeah, I'm about to. Can you take it over? I've stopped sharing. Okay.
Right, am I just about there?
Yes, you're not, yeah.
Right. Okay, so guys, thanks for the opportunity. I've chosen a slightly different company from which one Martin had. I'll put it in the context of that company that was on the slide. This one is simply busier, so we can see more. So here we have a company called Saperix Lab. And we see in front of us sort of a timeline of the security rating for this company. Now, the security rating from BitSight consists of a number of components. Let me just scroll down there. It has 55% of the score is based on compromised systems. 35% is based on due diligence, and I'll kind of delve into this a little bit later. Sorry, excuse me. And then 10% on the user behavior. Over the years, BitSight have validated the score, and the lower the score, the higher the likelihood of a breach. The score is not a breach predictor, but they have found that whenever there's a breach and they go back in the data, they find that the score was typically low in most cases. The data that they use for the security rating comes from a host of publicly available resources. BitSight doesn't do any scanning, but they do use the data from those that do internet-wide scanning. BitSight also controls the largest malware sinkhole on the internet, from which they get a lot of information. They also get information from passive DNS and all sorts of other sources. So this is generally available information on the internet that would also be, a lot of them would also be available to attackers. So the score is made up out of these components, and just have a look before we go to look at the detailed score. If you look at the compromised systems on the left-hand side, so remember this is 55% of the score. This side looks at botnet infections, looking at spam, malware, unsolicited communication, but also potentially exploited. And clearly the sinkhole that they've got plays a big role in here. We have also user behavior. You can see that file sharing is a big component there, well, the only component there. And they look at a number of things, and you can see torrents play a role in there, but also other public file sharing locations. And what they're looking for is not necessarily somebody sharing movies, but also, but more particular company information that's being shared. If we go back to well, come across to the middle, to the, and then right at the bottom, there's obviously the public disclosures, which they also take into account for your score. And if you look at diligence, that's a lot of things that has to do with cyber hygiene mostly. The first two has to do with email. But then there's a couple to do with your SSL communication, certificates, configurations around that. Open ports, a very common thing. Open ports unintentionally left open. Patching is in there. Versions of service software, old desktop software, those kind of things. But let's go back to the score. So you can see here, Sapirix Lab. The blue band that we've got there, that's the technology industry range. So in general, Sapirix Lab is below below their peers in the industry. And if you look at the kind of incidents that have happened, you'll see the first one was, well, first one in this year in review was potentially exploited by a thing called Top Tools. You can click on Top Tools. It will give you the detail, and we also give you remediation information. And you can see all this activity. If you look at here around about this time frame, we see there's a backdoor exchange, proxy logon. Right, so that's something exploited by the Hafnium group that's been in the news recently. I guess it's the next big one after the whole SolarWinds debacle. And this Sapirix Lab has also been kind of hit with that. Right? And you can see the rating coming down all the time. Now, the effect of these incidents, based on the incident, it sits there for either 60 days, maybe 3 months, or maybe a longer period, depending on the kind of incident that is there. How do you kind of change this, improve your security rating? Luckily, BitSight does give us some assistance to that. If we scroll down, there's a discussion about remediation strategy. And in this specific case for Sapirix Lab, if you look at the open ports, you kind of address those. And again, the detail is there. I don't want to dig into all the detail at this point. That will give you 30 points, bring back in your score, addressing your SSL certificates and your SSL configurations. We can also get reports out of BitSight that we can use for reporting back to the board, for example. Just have a quick look at that. Here's a company overview report for Sapirix Lab that I just created this morning, well, 5 minutes ago. So you can see there's a, there's a summary of what we saw on the screen, and some more detail that could be useful for reporting back to the board. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I looked at Sapiric's lab simply because it shows more activity, but it's actually part of a group. And if I look at the tree, I can see where it fits in. So there's a group called Sapiric's Inc. And they have just gone and created all their subsidiaries, defined the subsidiaries to kind of indicate where the big problems is. So in this way, you can look at your security posture. You can understand where the problems are. So clearly for Sapiric's, it would be their lab, their testing environment. But they've gone and they've also self-published what they want industry to look at when they look at Sapiric's. And you can see their due diligence is actually fairly good. And in fact, it's quite boring because it's a solid line that's been around 760, 750 for the last year. Martin, does that about cover everything?
Yeah, that does. I think so. If you want to give me the screen back, I can round off. Have you got, can you see or not?
Yep, you can see.
Great. Okay, just let me round off a little bit. So Ronnie's gone through this, so I won't, but we are making available through our colleagues at Cyberspace a free assessment if anybody wants one. We are able to, got BitSites okay to process and pull off reports for any companies attending the session today. So please feel free to ask for that. Yeah. So from here, really, you know, there's other things that we need to be looking at, and things like, can you do an Active Directory assessment? How secure is your Active Directory? Where's the weak links? We can provide that as well. Xero Trust, can you look at the communications and see where you've potentially got untrustworthy communications? Do you understand your vulnerability situation? And importantly, things like the end of life for software. It's magic having software that's very old, but it's, well, it's not magic, but it's generally, everybody we work with has got some systems which are old. How do they protect those? But knowing what you've got and what is coming end of life is quite important. I don't know if anybody saw the major breach that occurred with a file sharing company called Excellion about 3 weeks ago. And everybody was up in arms about it. And in fact, what they were all, most of them were using very old, it was a very old version of Excellion they were still using that was breached, and not dissimilar to, you know, the Microsoft Exchange breach of a couple of weeks back. You know, that's what happens. If you're running older stuff, it becomes much more of an easier target. And then how do you do security validation? How do you look? We've talked about this one from the outside with BitSite looking in. How do you do it inside the organization? Again, we're looking at techniques that effectively perform internal automated penetration testing and show you the results. They show you where your gaps are. They show you where you've got systems that have vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Therefore, they're a priority. So those are some of the things. And then more than that, it's actually adopting approaches like, do you know your assets? Do you know your mission critical services? Do you know the business impact? Spend more time and money on those than on things that aren't as important. You can't, your budgets are tight. You can't spend on everything. There's a whole bunch of things you need to look at. I'm not going to go through these, but really it is about looking at the key assets, the risk profile of that. How do you currently protect them? How should you protect them? That's really building a plan of what needs to change. And unfortunately, we often change application and technology platforms to support the business. But we don't, in line with that, we don't analyze and refresh our security management technology to fit the bill. So often we're running legacy security tools which were designed before some of the problems we've got today were even thought of. and we blame them when things go wrong. Well, it's because we didn't actually have a life cycle for them. We get behind the business, you know, and really look at key things. You know, how do you protect Active Directory, and how do you defend against ransomware, and how do you defend against phishing? I mean, those are probably three of the most important things you can do. Look at those in detail. Look at internet facing, look at your supply chain, who are your third parties. Again, that's one of BitSight's practices is third-party risk, and look at your cloud configurations. Your single biggest weakness in cloud today is that it's fairly new to everybody, the skills, the expertise, and misconfigurations for credentials and for service configurations like Amazon's AWS's S3 buckets are leaving gaping great holes for cyber criminals to leverage. So those would be 6 key things, I think. And then really what we've started to see increasingly is adopting and following industry practices. So the USA's NIST cyber framework is a really, really good framework to look at in terms of particularly the 5 key steps: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And how do you apply those? Often we're looking at the middle piece, detection, and we're not looking at much else. And that's probably because once upon a time, all of our tools, that's what they did. They detected things. Now we need to look at that whole encompass. There's no point in being able to detect ransomware unless you can recover from it. And if your backup isn't secure and immutable, then you're stuffed. You wasted the money on the detection piece. And finally, what we're seeing is the adoption of what's known as the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which looks at in detail and very, very detailed how do attacks actually occur, what tactics and techniques do our cyber criminals actually use. So you can see those. And then they've just recently launched a product called MITRE Shield, or a service, they've added to their framework MITRE Shield, which actually now tells you options on how to defend against those specific TTPs, those specific techniques that somebody would be using. And then what we're seeing is that is being embedded often now. These are, and it's a key question for software vendors when you're talking to them, supporting the MITRE framework. It's becoming a common language for security vendors nowadays. Does your product map to the MITRE ATT&CK framework? So that I'm talking, does your pen testing map to that? Whatever it is, does it map to this? So we're talking a common language. And I won't do this, but those are some of the key takeaways. But if you have got software vendors who are doing that, what you should end up with is something like this. If you're looking at next generation monitoring, you're looking at software which pulls all the data together and will give you an attack story. It will give you the timeline of when something first started, where it moved to, what phase it's in. And from here, you can build out, one, you know what's going on. You're no longer looking at tens of thousands of millions of logs and trying to write rules for it. It's now surfacing this information in high fidelity incidents, what is going on. And obviously at any point in this, you can develop actions. So I've seen this machine got breached, a user clicked on a PDF, got some malware. That machine then communicated with a web server. You can see that, and you can write routines that say, at this point, disable that, do this, do the following. And this is really because vendors are using things like the MITRE framework, which makes it a lot easier for organizations to, well, A, they're using MITRE framework, and B, they're underpinning that with some really advanced machine learning, which is what we're seeing today. But this is typically what you should be seeing. Your security analysts should be looking at investigating and responding to incidents, not churning through logs and data to try and work out what is going on. So that's that. And then just to round off, just a few key takeaways. Well, I think we've covered a lot of these. you've got to mitigate where you cannot manage. So vulnerabilities, patching, user behavior, user activity, what users do. You can't manage those 100%. So you've got to look at ways of mitigating it. So, you know, that's where we see the role of Xero Trust and multi-factor passwordless type technologies. Secure your key infrastructure, your key databases, Active Directory, web and mobile platforms, etc. We talked about adopting secure access with a variety of techniques. Be specific around how do you stop lateral movement or how do you minimize it, ransomware and phishing. And there's some really niche technologies that really focus in on these. So it's not broad brush, it's looking at things very specifically. Understand your security posture. We talked about using, you know, things like the NIST cyber security framework. Don't just monitor, move to active defense, active cyber defense. It's actually a term that's now being used a lot. You know, it's not about detecting, it's about responding to. Prevention and response, actually. So I see something happening, software should deal with it if at all possible. Because you don't have time to detect an attack and then wait 3 hours while you work out what it is and get somebody out of bed. So we see that, and we see the role there of not just software, but we see the role of specialist organizations offering managed detection and response. They work 24/7 with some of the best guys in the world, and we should leverage them where we can. The risk isn't past your door, it's not in your data center, it's all over the show, and it's going to get worse with you know, IoT, and it's going to get worse with what we're seeing now is the growth in attacks on industry, on manufacturing, on oil plants, on power plants, on healthcare. You know, there have been deaths because of attacks on hospitals. So yeah, we shouldn't forget about IT hygiene, but we have to realize the real world limitations of it. Get your employees on board and spend time and you know, needed money on research. You know, the security analysts should have time to actually look at what's going on in the world, attend some of the conferences, get some of the information that's out there and use that. And finally, you know, security's got to be aligned to the technology that you're using to support the business and to the applications that the business is using. So those are my key takeaways. I'd like to thank you all, and leave you with a quote. Yeah, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, a few minutes of cyber incident to ruin it, which I think is fairly true nowadays. But thank you all very much. I am available via cyberspace for any follow-up conversations you might have, information sharing, etc. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Martins, for the presentation. It's an exciting moment, and you really touch so much on the subject matters. It interests me to know that you cover a whole lot, that it will take someone to go over it all over to be able to digest what you talk about. I appreciate your knowledge and extensive work on this webinar. Briefly, before we move to questions, we are offering interested organizations, some services which are divided in two parts. Testing the organization from outside and also testing the organization from inside. Any interested organization, you will have to indicate your interest. This is a freebie that comes along with this webinar. So for our panelists, we have some questions that we audience are asking. First on the list, someone is asking if it's okay for them to pay a ransom for ransomware attack.
Is it okay to pay for one? I think it's more the reality of the question is, depending on my security design, do I have an option? yeah, I mean, we've seen companies stay down for 3 or 4 weeks with critical systems while they recover and not pay ransomware. That should be the principle, not to pay. But in reality, there's more organizations that do pay than don't pay. And maybe that situation is being exacerbated by the introduction of cyber insurance. So now I can insure against ransomware, which in itself, encourages people to be able to go, okay, I have to pay it. And reality is I would say no, but I realize that in practice, in some cases, that it's a no option. And we've seen that, there's enough material overseas, companies that have admitted paying because they felt they didn't have a choice. If your factory is down and you cannot get it back up, what do you do? And somebody wants $50,000 and the factory drives $500,000 worth of business a day. Are you prepared to take 6 weeks downtime? I know it's a moral question, an ethical question, but the reality is when the rubber hits the road, you make the choice. And I can't say which way. We're lucky enough, I suppose. We're a small business, 100 odd people, and most of our, there's nothing we got that stops us running our business because we're an information service provider. So I would probably go, we can get by. But the closer you get, if you're a hospital, what do you do? Now, I'm not talking about your production. I'm not talking about your finance system. What do you do if somebody takes away your operating theatre devices? What do you do? Unless you've really got your plan well, I would think more people will pay than actually don't pay.
Thank you for answering that question. Here is another question. With the partners-led adoption, will you say two-factor authentication using cloud services such as Google or Microsoft, is it sufficient? If not, what will you recommend to protect uncritical access data? Okay.
Well, I would, I'm not a big fan of Microsoft Hello. My personal preference always, and the guys in the office, we have these arguments. I rather turn to specialist vendors than vendors who produce most of the vulnerabilities. So I would look at things like support for biometrics. So things like 4 fingers on your phone as a way of authenticating, or password companies like, there's a company in the US called Hyper, fully passwordless. Your password's not even stored in the central vault anymore. It's not in it actually sits on the device. So if somebody wants to get your credentials, because they do exist, so your credentials now exist on your phone, not in the central store, and somebody's got to attack me personally. So it does require rethinking, but there are several new vendors, and a lot of this has come out of, what do you want to call it, out of the consumer side of life. If you look at Hyper, and there's another company called Dayon, and their security was built for internet banking to the consumer, and now it's being used to improve internal business security. Because if you think about it, if the security we use inside our organization of how we log on to machines was used for internet banking or mobile banking, there'd be a lot more fraud. So we're looking at those things. What has come out of the business world for securing users, and how can that be applied to our own businesses in terms of our IT services that we deliver internally? So I can provide a range of suggestions on that, and areas where there's research material. That's not a problem. I'm just not a big fan of the big vendor tool sets. One, they don't never seem to be the best, and B, they get targeted a lot. That's what happens if you think about it. Yeah, they're a lot better to target than.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. I said, how? Okay, you're saying that how can the speaker simplify how hybrid cloud player will cope with attack since it's been reported that hybrid infrastructure means more attack vectors?
Yeah. Okay. I did respond to that online, but I will go through it because I think it's quite important. Yeah, your attack surface increases because the more stuff you've got of different technology, whether and let's face it, many customers are using AWS and Azure for different things, alongside Office 365, which although it's Microsoft, it's not running on the same as Azure platforms. So that's another attack surface, and they're using multiple SaaS services, and each one of those is running somewhere. So they're all, the reality is that what we've looked at, and we've taken what's called the cloud security model from an organization called CSA, which is a Cloud Security Alliance. We've taken that, we've taken the Gartner Cloud security model, and we've also taken what we've been doing in terms of on-premise. And what we found is that a lot, the vectors you look at largely are common, access, authentication, workload. Doesn't matter whether I've got a container on Kubernetes in AWS or a container in Kubernetes on VMware. We've looked at those elements and said, you should be designing security to be hybrid wherever possible, which means that I'm not having 3 different tools or 4 different tools. I'm looking at common approaches, common policies, and I'm looking at as far as possible, single solution security technologies, which will provide me with that capability. There are things, so the best example of that is cloud configurations, and fun enough, cloud credentials, which have been seen as probably the 2 biggest weaknesses and the 2 biggest problems with cloud. And I think there you will find that particularly with configurations, they're very different to on-premise configurations. On-premise, we think about CIS controls on servers. In the cloud, S3 buckets are completely different. That does, so you can still apply some of that, but there's a lot more weaknesses or potential for weaknesses, because you can misconfigure storage inside your organization and it won't get breached. Misconfigure it in AWS and there's somebody waiting to, or potentially. So the risk is a lot higher. So there we've said there are specialist tools which have been created to, one, bring visibility to misconfigurations and credential weaknesses, and then how do you address those? And there are tools that will actually help you, or the cloud tools themselves, where you can then automate the remediation of that. That's probably at the moment the areas we see as different. Going forward, I think obviously in the application side, we haven't really investigated serverless computing yet, but Lambda security will come up, and I've no doubt that microservices will start to introduce weaknesses we have no idea about. The one that we do think it will be unique, or not unique, but will be important. It was important on-prem, but it's more important in the cloud, and it's going to be API weaknesses. And we're talking about things that network security individuals and often security teams don't get involved in, But as we move to an API economy where banks are using APIs to communicate, for instance, and you're using, then they become a target. And, let's be fair, developers develop. They're not necessarily the most security aware people. So they leave lots of holes behind. And somebody will say, if I can breach the API, then I've got access to everything that API talks to. Northbound, southbound, thank you very much. So it's more stretching the imagination as to where my next attack vectors that I haven't even considered. On the infrastructure side of life, the things where we come from, I think we're pretty competent at going, we should be able to protect cloud from a workload infrastructure, all that sort of thing. But when you start to think about the code side of life and the applications and the APIs, then I think it introduces areas we actually really haven't yet thought about. Same as I said about supply chain, third parties. If you're maybe not so cyber, but from a compliance, third parties, I share data with somebody processes data for me. You know, I'm the data owner. I'm the guy who's subject to the compliance regulation, but somebody else is processing it for me. Are they compliant? Is there a risk there? And the other way around. We've had examples of, corporate customers, a large, what do you call it? A large provincial government, which had access to their bank's banking platform, because you give them that, they sign on and do things. And guess what? Their desktop protocols were so weak that somebody was able to breach their environment and get onto the bank's environment. So, you know, getting into your house was really difficult because you've got some big Rottweilers and some really high fences, but your neighbour hasn't. So I break in next door and dig a tunnel to you or whatever. And that's really the things you start looking at. And sometimes with just-in-time processing nowadays, you know, you look at things, you go, well, which vendors of mine, if they weren't available, if they were ransomware, how would that affect my business? Now, again, in a lot of the information processing businesses, banking, etc., insurance, it's maybe not such a big deal. But in traditional supply chain, where your parts and materials are arriving just in time, if I ransomware the guy who's delivering those, your business is going to be affected come what may. So do you know how secure they actually are? So it's a fairly, the challenge is it's getting wider and wider and wider in terms of the scope, and you have to map it and then pick what you think is what you and business agree are the priority areas, and then try and build that plan and manage the workload, manage them as units of work so you can address specific things. You cannot solve every problem at the same time, but you do have to risk rate them. Otherwise, you don't know whether you're actually focusing on the right thing. And often security teams are what do you want to call it? They are not close to business. So they make their own call, what's important. And sometimes that's vogue, what appears in the news. You know, 2 years ago, it might have been DDoS is the biggest threat to the world. And then last year it was endpoint security is the biggest thing since sliced bread. You're going to have this. So you look at that and you go, if I'm following that and I'm not discussing it with business, I could get things wrong.
Thank you very much. There's another question here, but I think the writer probably he wasn't following along. Let me just read the question. How do we protect ourselves against cyber threats, cyber theft?
How do you protect assets against
cyber theft?
Okay, well, it depends on the asset, number one. But let's assume that in my view, an asset would be if you're a bank, your payment system, your payment processing system for your cards would be a critical asset. If you were an electricity producer, it will be your production plant control systems. So first off, understand those, and then look at how do you reduce the attack surface. And I think the ways we've talked about that, I see the ways of doing that are number one, you limit the access to only the authorized people and only to the authorized functions they're allowed to do. And then you make those people not easily, imitated. So that's where multi-factor biometrics come in. So you make it very difficult for somebody to get to that asset, number one. Number two, you put a fence around it, and that's where we talk about things like micro-segmentation, where I'm using software to dictate what can talk to this machine and what cannot. So if you're not authorized, you're not even going to see me. And if you do manage to get to me, I'm going to block you because you're not authorized. So I'm making it really difficult. And then if I do manage to get on, then let's assume on that machine, I will be running some sophisticated software, which will be looking at behavior and taking real-time action on behavior. So an example of that could be an EDR technology, which endpoint detection and response technology, which actually sees a significantly high increase in activity, IO activity, read and writes to a disk. Okay, that's an indication of encryption, and it's authorized to actually disconnect that machine at that point in time without talking to anybody. So how do I get to active defense? And that will vary. So that's the way I would do it. And can I have things that, so for instance, if you look at the the supply chain attack I spoke about with SolarWinds, one of the challenges there was that users had sophisticated endpoint detection and response on their machines. But what happened was that attacker coded scripts to go check, first off, what endpoint software were they running, what security software, and then if it was software that they could not disable, they stopped the attack because they didn't want to get noticed. If it was software that they could disable, they had a routine to disable it. If it was software that they could stop by changing the Windows registry, they changed the Windows registry. So they built up this. Now, so in a lot of cases, they did that, they achieved it. They stopped the endpoint software, security software running. If at the same time, that organization had a network detection and response, so looking at network traffic, it would immediately have seen, following that, it would have seen a communication out to the attacker's command and control domain. And you would have picked it up there and you would have been able to do something. So sometimes it's not one thing that solves the problem. It's, do I have visibility where I can connect the dots, and based upon connecting the dots, take some action. So it really is, and that's where I get back to looking at each of those types of attack. If you understand them in detail, and I don't, we've got technical guys who do that for a living, whose job it is. I tend to look at it from a management viewpoint. But if you decompose that, you either go, well, if I've got to have this, that, and that covered. How do I do that? Because if I have that gap, something can occur, and I can't blame the endpoint. I can't say because I've got the world's market-leading endpoint detection and response system, it should stop every attack. Well, it depends on the nature of the attack. If the attack has come through your web application, it may not even be running on that, so you wouldn't have seen it. So you've got to decompose those and go, yeah, how do I? So I think you can get down to a very, very manageable. And an example of that is definitely in international and in South Africa, the large banks. The large banks are not subject to huge breaches. They built their security over time, and they've got significant investment in teams because their business depends on it. So we're seeing the attackers now attack lots of other people before they attack banks. If you look around, Maersk Shipping, who was it? It was Coors, the brewers in the States, got hit with ransomware late last week. They've been down 7 days, I think, or whatever. So they're hitting non-financial services customers for ransom demands because they know that they've not made the investment that the banking sector has actually made over, and that's reality. We always used to be people are targeting the banks. Now they target the banks for fraud if they can, not for ransomware. Most banks got that pretty well covered, or the ones we work with anyway. So then they're looking at new ways. So I think you've got to look at the asset and say, how do I design for it? Active Directory is a good one. Microsoft used to have a thing, and I don't know anybody. They used to have a thing called Red Forest, which was their publication on how do you secure Active Directory. 4 months ago, they announced that Red Forest was end of life, and you should adopt the Xero Trust principles. So now you've got to go and redesign. You've got to go rethink that. But if you think it through, you can design. The tools are available to actually to secure your Active Directory. You've got to take it, but you've got to take it as a single thing and really decompose it and look at where the attack risk, where the risks are. Misconfiguration, unauthorized changes, whatever. And you go through that. How does domain access? How do users? How do you stop you? How do you ensure that only and also the domain user who's accessing is the domain user. Yeah, how do you secure that? You look at all these pieces and then you put a solution together. Unfortunately, there's no single silver bullet for any particular any particular asset, because they're all different. Banking, SWIFT, we're seeing a lot. PCI. If I need to protect my PCI assets, you've got to decompose them. From a security viewpoint, I think historically we've been used to defending protecting the endpoint and putting antivirus and file integrity on servers and things like that. The nature of attacks today are far more sophisticated, and you've got to assume that you're breached. You can't protect on the desktop fully. So you've got to assume you're going to get breached, and therefore you need to defend differently based upon the assets that support your business. We spoke to a mining house a couple of weeks back on security, and one of the questions we ask is, what is the most critical system in your organization? And then they came back, totally surprised me. They said, it's the time and attendance system that sits at the mine that allows mine workers to go down the shaft. If that's not available, we can do no work. It's very unique to them. So without knowing that, you could be protecting their finance system, their HR system, but their business is highly susceptible because that time and attendance system, guess what? It's IP connected. So that's why I think, anyway, you can do it. You've got to look at the different, the combination of defensive approaches you need, and that's got to be measured against the value of the asset.
Thank you very much. I am having difficulty of even taking other questions because questions are just popping in. Probably I'll just take one more question, and probably we send the answers to the remaining by via mail or any other means. I have one question that talks more about bit sites that was demonstrated by Ronnie. I don't know if Ronnie will take this. Let me just take that question. How important is security posture score as provided by SiteBit today, both for organization and that of your partner, learning from SolarWinds supply chain attack scenario? Should I come again? The importance of security posture, the score provided by this site to organization and your partners, learning from the...
Yeah, sorry. Well, first off, I think BitSite would not have helped in detecting the SolarWinds breach. Ronnie might, because it wasn't coming from one could argue, yes, if you were said SolarWinds was one of your key vendors and you were monitoring them with BitSite, there's the SolarWinds, it may well have shown that SolarWinds had cyber risks in terms of things like open ports. How did the attackers got in some way? Yeah, so we're guessing they got in through the network and through the desk. So that would give you an indication. Would it guarantee you? Would it guarantee you? I'd have said no, because it was it's a fairly unique attack, and only now. So let's give you an example on that. The MITRE guys have taken that attack and they've created, new TTPs for their model because it didn't exist before this attack. So I think you could see that certain vendors of yours have got poor cyber health, and therefore they're at higher risk. It wouldn't have said to you this was going to happen. And again, would you have put SolarWinds as one of your key suppliers and monitored them? Probably not likely. I think you've got to look at supply chain in terms of that supply chain attack is about putting malicious code in software. It's not about vulnerabilities of software. It's putting malicious code in software. So you've then got to look and go, actually, we download how much software a year from the packet, from the all of the software packages we own, all of the updates. Can we inspect that as part of the process to see if there's malicious code in there? We test code for vulnerabilities. Yes, we run it through, we look at it. Now we're saying, can you test it for malicious code before it actually gets deployed into your organization? So I think we wouldn't have discovered it. We would have said, because I don't think many people would have put SolarWinds as one of their top vendors. So you probably have picked the ones that really are close to your business. Ronnie, you may disagree.
Yeah, I think in general, I agree with you. I did look at SolarWinds, their security posture score in December, and they were not stellar performers. It wasn't that bad that you'd make a decision to not use their software based on that. But if you take it the other way around, if a company like SolarWinds look at the security posture, they can see where they can improve, and they can do that to improve their own security posture. Maybe not in Africa, but in Europe and in the United States, a lot of insurers now actually use the score from BitSight specifically, their security posture management score, when they look at your policy and your cybersecurity. So there is a distinct benefit when you use the score and you actively try to improve your rating by fixing those things that are wrong. And that maybe is what SolarWinds could have done. Obviously they didn't. Now they are fixing things after the fact.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Martins has anything to say.
No, I'm fine. No,
okay.
Yeah, I think the thing about tools like BitSight and internal security validation, really, they help you understand where your weaknesses are and where the weaknesses, and on BitSight, the weaknesses of your key vendors. It helps you work out, where am I spending my money? And when you're doing internal validation, like continuous internal pen testing, for instance, you can actually say, was that money well spent? Because I'm being, I could be exploited, but I've just spent a fortune on this software and it's not doing the job, or the people you have aren't doing the job, one of the two. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've gone this far, and really we appreciate your wealth of experience. It has been a nice moment with you. We hope this will continue. And for the viewers, we want to thank you very much for this opportunity to have us host you on this webinar. Please, I'm actually reiterating that we are giving freebies for interested organizations. We are offering 2 kinds of freebies after this webinar. Testing your organization from the external and also testing it from internal. These are services that we want to provide for you. As you indicate interest, we will make available this opportunity. Thank you once again. We hope to see you next time. Thank you, Martins. Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.